by themselves couldn't do it. The Royal Navy is the greatest sea power in the world, and it's invincible when it's attacking a port city. St. Lawrence provides deep water access needed by the British, and English commander could easily retake and hold Canada against other invasions. So at the very best, this invasion has little hope of achieving any permanent gain, and at worst, as it looks like it turns out here, it was a huge loss of necessary forces. But all right, that's the downer stuff. Let's end on a happy note. So let's talk about something that is remembered fondly, Knox's Cannon Run. James, what's that all about?
Yeah, and I have to say, I'm proud to say that as far as I know, the term cannon run is my term. I made that up.
Okay.
If you look at a textbook, you will not see that unless I'm mistaken. I mean, probably somebody.
I was thinking of that 80s movie, Cannonball Run.
Cannonball Run. Oh, no. Hopefully this will be much more entertaining. Anyway, let me go ahead. I'm going to go out of order here. Let's talk about Henry Knox. Henry Knox is a fascinating character. Listeners, if you remember our Civil War series, you remember how Scott and I constantly marveled about how so many Civil War generals had no military experience whatsoever. We saw, and some of them, despite their lack of experience, turned out to be really very good commanders. We saw Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, who had been a philosophy professor. Turned out to be an outstanding commander. We saw for the Union Benjamin Grierson, who had been a music teacher. We saw politicians, most of whom were not very good. Some were. We saw people like Nathan Bedford Forrest, who had been a businessman, a slave trader. Not the nicest guy. But the point is, he didn't have any military experience, and he turned into a constant thorn in the side of the Union. We saw an Episcopal bishop. He was okay. He wasn't particularly great, but we saw all kinds of people become high-ranking military commanders on both sides. Well, in the American Revolution, that certainly does not happen in the British. I mean, the British Army is professional, and all these top generals had been in the Army for years and years and years. Most of them had fought in the 7 Years' War. Some of them had fought in North America. We've already talked about Gage, for example. We've talked about William Howe. But on the American side, they didn't have a professional army. They didn't have very many people that some Americans had fought in the French and Indian War, but a lot were too young to have fought. And Henry Knox is one of those guys. Henry Knox was born in 1750 in Boston to a shipmaster who was lost at sea when Henry was 9. So like a lot of these people in early American history, Henry Knox lost his dad at a very young age. Washington had lost his dad. Thomas Jefferson, a lot of people grew up without a father in the house. And this forced these kind of people like Knox to work and to earn money at a very early age. So from the age of 9, he worked to help support his family. Knox was almost entirely self-educated. He didn't get a lot of schooling. He certainly didn't go to college, kind of like Washington, kind of like Nathaniel Greene. We've touched on him. We'll talk about him more later. Knox eventually becomes a successful bookseller. So he's like you and me, Scott. He's a nerd. He likes to read, and he sells books. He loved reading in particular about the military arts. See, there's another thing he had in common with us. He was an amateur military historian. Well, Scott's are professional. I'm
military, so
okay. I'm semi-pro, but he was an amateur. He loved reading about the military arts, and as did Nathaniel Greene. He and Nathaniel Greene struck up a friendship because they both loved reading military history. Greene would often come to Knox's bookstore, and they became friends, as I mentioned. Knox was a large man by any standards, but especially by the standards of the time. He was 6 foot tall, which back then you were a giant if you were 6 feet tall. And he weighed about 250 pounds, so he was a very large man. He had lost 2 fingers in a bird hunting expedition prior to the war. So he had a couple of missing fingers. He kept it in a white handkerchief or a cloth wrapped around his hand. And so, again, Scott, he's a very interesting fella. I know I've said that 5,000 times, but it's fascinating to me that this guy who's a bookseller, a history nerd, he's going to turn into one of Washington's most valuable subordinates.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that. I didn't know that much about him, and that's to my shame because I am from the gorgeous metropolis of Knoxville, Iowa, the second biggest Knoxville in the United States behind Knoxville, Tennessee. And there's about 8 or 9. It's kind of like Springfield. There's a whole bunch of those across the United States named after Henry Knox. And just a little bit of his cultural background that can give context not just to him, but also what revolutionary American society looks like and helps explain some of the animosity against the British. Knox was Scotch-Irish by background. And I mentioned earlier that on the Quebec campaign, many of those soldiers were Scotch-Irish, and the hope was that they would be hardy. And they were hardy, but they weren't woodsmen. But many troops were Scotch-Irish in the Continental Army. That's because from 1710 to 1775, about 250,000 Presbyterians from different parts of Ireland arrived in America in order to escape religious, political, and economic persecution or just general hardship. And these Scotch-Irish have a very different worldview from the Anglican English, and this really colors their loyalties to England, and it also affects how they farm and how they fight. Andrew Jackson comes from the Scotch-Irish stock, if you want to get a sense of what kind of people these were, of these scrawny SOBs who...
Tough customers, short temper.
cannot accept defeat, even if they've been pinned 5 times, which is how Andrew Jackson wrestled.
All right.
Listen to our Presidential Fight Club episodes with Andrew Jackson to give you an idea of Scotch-Irish American culture. And Knox is from that. He's more of the gentlemanly, refined stock, being a learned bookman, but this is where he's from. So about a third or even as many as half of the Continental troops were Scotch-Irish. So a little bit of info on Knox. And yeah, so tell us a little bit about what he does and his famous episode. Hey everyone, Scott here. We're going to take a very short break for a word from our sponsors.
All right, so Knox had come to Washington's attention. Washington, I don't want to get too psychological, Scott, but he seemed to have a desire to have not a father figure, what's a son figure. Washington never had any of his own children. He never had a son or a daughter. And we're going to see over the course of the war, Washington is really good at finding young talent and raising them up. You know, he doesn't say, well, how much experience do you have? Oh, none. Oh, well, then get out of here. It's almost as if Washington prefers people with little or no experience because he's going to train them and he's going to put these people in very significant positions of authority. We'll see Knox. We'll see Nathaniel Greene, who we've already mentioned a little bit, Alexander Hamilton, John Lawrence, several others. The Marquis de Lafayette is going to come over. So Washington's going to have raise up around him a little core of younger men that were young enough to be his sons. And Knox is one of those. They're going to get a lot of responsibility for such young men. So Knox is 25 years old in 1775. All right, so let's go back and think about the situation around Boston one more time. Let me set the stage again just to refresh everybody's memory. The British Army was bottled up in Boston. Everybody remember the ping pong paddle?
With the Cookie Monster bite bitten out of it, yes.
Yeah. Cookie. So, yes, very irregular shaped ping pong paddle, surrounded by water, almost completely 360 degrees, but not quite because there was a little neck, the handle of the ping pong paddle, which connected to the mainland. So the British are on the paddle. They're surrounded almost entirely by water. And even more significantly, beyond the water is a lot of high ground. The Battle of Bunker Hill was all about denying some of that high ground to the Americans, but they couldn't get it all. So Washington had arrived by this time, and there were about 20,000 militiamen and the budding Continental Army, which Washington is trying desperately to whip into shape. These 20,000 or so Continental soldiers of various quality, they are surrounding the British, and they want to get them out. Now, Washington's aggressive. He wants to just attack. He wants to get in boats and just go hit them with all he's got. But his subordinates tell him, General Washington, that's a terrible idea. You don't want to do this. You don't want to take these ragtag, they're not horrible, but they're not great either. You don't want to take these guys across water where they'll get blown up before they even get to Boston. And then even if they do make it to Boston, they have to face seasoned professionals with good artillery. The Continentals didn't have much artillery. So they can't get into Boston, and they really don't have any way of driving the British out of Boston because they don't have cannon. So Henry Knox approaches Washington. He says, hey, General, remember how we captured Fort Ticonderoga? Yes. Well, Fort Ticonderoga had several dozen cannon. And Washington said, yes. And Henry Knox says, I think I can get them and bring them down here. What do you think? And Washington goes, absolutely. Of course, I'm paraphrasing. That's not the words that were spoken. I'm sure it was much more formal. But Washington says to Henry Knox, go get them. So Henry Knox is going to personally lead an expedition to march all the way up from Boston, up the Hudson River, into upstate New York to Fort Ticonderoga and grab those cannon. By the way, this is happening. Let me get the exact date. He's going to reach Ticonderoga on December 5th. So this is before the Americans had retreated from Canada. So I don't want everybody to think that, they're going to run into the other guys that were retreating from Canada. This is happening before Benedict Arnold. Well, this is kind of in the middle of the siege. Benedict Arnold is sitting outside of Quebec, and he's waiting for Montgomery to come. All right. So anyway, with that in mind, Knox takes a small group of soldiers. They trudge on up to Fort Ticonderoga. They grab the cannon. They bring them back on 42 sleds pulled by 80 yoke of oxen, and there's over 50 cannons of various types. He brought them over a frozen lake and frozen rivers through very difficult terrain. Again, roads were pretty much non-existent. And they arrived near Boston in late January. By this time, the British had already pretty much planned to evacuate Boston. They realized their position was untenable. But the arrival of these cannons is going to really put the icing on the cake. As I mentioned, Washington wanted to attack the British in Boston, but his subordinates said no. And that's an interesting thing, Scott, about Washington that I should mention. Washington would listen to his subordinates. With him as a commander, it was not my way or the highway. He would have a council of war. He would poll all of his subordinate commanders and say, what do you think? And if they overruled him, he would usually go with it. Now, there were other times when he would stick to his guns and just make a decision. But here, it's a good thing that he listened to them because it probably would have been disastrous if they had tried to attack into Boston. So instead, his subordinates say, let's put the cannon on the Dorchester Heights. This is a very high set of ground to the south of the town of Boston. And Washington agrees to this plan. Now, they have to be careful, Scott, because they can't just they have to do it secretly. They have to be sneaky. They can't just go up there in broad daylight and start building fortifications and dragging cannon up there, because if they do and the British see them, the British are just going to turn the cannons on them and blast them. Especially, we got to keep in mind that the British also had a lot of ships floating around and they had guns. So this is an amazing thing. I love this story. The Patriots are going to disguise what they did. They placed bales of hay along the shore so the British could not see what they were doing. The British would have seen and it's just hay. They're stacking up hay. And they also built the elements of a redoubt off-site. So remember, a redoubt is just kind of a small temporary fort. So instead of building it on the Dorchester Heights, they built it elsewhere. It's like prefabricated housing, Scott.
Yeah, Revolutionary are doing all your nailing of wooden posts together off-site.
That's right. And so they bring it almost ready to go. They just have to put it together. And to distract the British, they also, just for good measure, they use the cannons they have and they bombard Boston so that the British will be busy and they won't have that much time to be staring up. So what are the Americans doing right now? I wonder why they have all those bales of hay. They don't have time to think about that because they're getting blasted. The British fired back. And finally, on the night of March 4th, the Continentals dragged the parts of the redoubt up onto the heights and they finished building it. And the next morning, lo and behold, the British woke up to see the completed redoubt on the heights with several thousand men and 20 cannon guarding it. It would have seemed like, wow, a fort just popped up overnight. Great. And it's got cannon trained right on us. General Howe, the British commander, he's supposed